In this tutorial, we're going to be learning how to crochet the perfect granny square. So if you've ever crocheted a granny square that's come out a bit wonky or a bit holey, I'm going to share 7 tips as we make this granny square so that your squares will come out perfect every time. So let's get started. So the first tip is to not use a magic ring to start your granny squares. That's because the centre of your granny square is the weakest point. So we need to make sure that we've got lots of reinforcement here so that over the years your granny square doesn't open up at the centre over time, and magic rings really aren't strong enough for this. So we're going to make something called a chain ring, and I will take you through that step by step. So start by making a slip knot. It doesn't really matter what method you use for making your slip knot. This is how I like to make my slip knots. Then make 4 chains. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I'm going to slip stitch in my first chain to make a ring. So I'm slip stitching in this stitch here. So there is my slip stitch, and then if I wiggle this chain ring about a little bit, there's a hole that opens up at the center, and that's what we're going to crochet our first round into. Start by making a chain of 3. This counts as your first double crochet stitch. That's a double crochet in US terminology. So my second tip is, while we crochet round 1, we're going to crochet over the top of this yarn tail, catching it with our stitches, and that enables us to pull on it at the end of the round to make sure we don't end up with a hole at the center of our granny square like I have here. So to do that, we're going to lay our yarn tail alongside our chain ring as we crochet round 1. So let's make our first double crochet. So I'm going to put my hook into the center of that chain ring, that hole at the center of the chain ring, and I'm going to make sure my yarn tail is laid across my crochet hook at this point, and I'm going to catch it with this stitch. So I'm going to yarn over and pull up a loop, and as you can see, that stitch has now caught this yarn tail, and I need to make sure it's always next to my chain ring. So here you can see it's still over the top, it's being caught there by this yarn over. So I'm going to finish off that double crochet, then I'm going to make another double crochet. So I'm going back into the center of the chain ring, and again I'm making sure my yarn tail is laid across my crochet hook. Yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. So that's my third double crochet done, because we count this first chain as our first double crochet. If I show you at the back, this yarn tail is now underneath these stitches here, and we're going to continue doing that for the rest of the round. So to make sure our granny square isn't too holey, we're just going to be doing 2 chains at every corner. I know some patterns recommend 3 chains. I always recommend 2 chains because it gives you a lot more options for when you're joining your granny squares. So we're going to chain 2 here, 1, 2. Then I'm going to make 3 more double crochet into the chain ring, making sure that that yarn tail is being caught with every stitch. So I'm crocheting over that yarn tail with every stitch. And then I'm going to make another corner chain, so 2 chains, and then we're going to repeat this around until we've made 4 groups of 3 double crochet and 4 chain 2 spaces, finishing off with a chain 2. So repeat those 3 double crochets, chain 2 all the way around, and I'll meet you back at the end of the round and I'll show you how we fasten off this round. So this is what your square should look like at the end of round 1. I've made 4 groups of 3 double crochet and 4 chain 2 corners. I've just made the final chain 2 corner here, but I've not joined yet. And that's because most granny square patterns will tell you to join off with a slip stitch here. However, I prefer to do an invisible join on every round, and what that means is that I've always got a nice flat granny square, there's no bumps from a slip stitch, and it just makes the whole granny square flatter and neater. However, whenever I teach an invisible join, I usually show how to do it with a needle, but when you're in a granny square zone, you don't want to be having to drop your crochet hook and find a needle at the end of every round. So I'm going to show you how to do it with just your crochet hook. So snip your yarn tail with an end long enough to weave in later. I usually say about 5 or 6 inches is fine. Then use your crochet hook to pull that yarn tail through the second chain that we've just made here. So to do an invisible join with your crochet hook, take your crochet hook and put it from the back of the crochet underneath both the loops at the top of the stitch next to the starting chain here. Then lay your yarn tail over your crochet hook and use your crochet hook to pull that tail through that stitch there. Just like that. And then from the back, we're going to go underneath the back loop of the second chain of this corner, so just here. So my hook's going under that loop there, like that, from the back. Then yarn over and pull that tail through. And that's usually where an invisible join finishes. But if I'm going to be crocheting another round on this, I like to do one more step to make sure that it doesn't come loose as I'm crocheting. So I'm going to put my hook through the back loop of that stitch we've just made. So here's our starting chain and this is the invisible join we've just made. I'm going to put my hook underneath the back loop of that invisible join, yarn over and pull through the tail. And I can give this a pull to tighten, and there we've fastened it off. And when we do invisible joins, we need to make sure we're securing our ends really, really well. I have a whole tutorial about weaving ends into granny squares because it's a bit different than when you're weaving it into rows of crochet. So I will link that down in the description if you're not sure about how to properly secure your ends. So our final step before we move on to round 2 is to turn our square over, and then we're going to pull on our first tail, so that tail at the centre of the square. And what that'll do is, because we've crocheted over the top of it, we can get rid of this little hole at the centre. So I'm going to hold my granny square and give it a pull, and then we no longer have a big hole at the centre of our granny square. And when we go back and secure this end in, you might need to give it another pull just before you sew the end in, because it might have worked loose as we've crocheted our granny square. So for round 2, I've just pulled up another colour, because for this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to change colour every time. I do have a tutorial for a 1-colour granny square, I'll also link down in the description. So before we move on to round 2, I'm going to explain why we're doing what we're doing for tip number 4. So my tip number 4 is to turn at the end of every round. So if you've ever crocheted a granny square and you've found that if we look along here, our edges aren't straight at all, they're kind of curving along the way, and the centre of our granny square, as our square gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it starts spiralling round and it's not straight anymore. You can kind of see it here as these rows aren't on top of each other. So the reason why this is that crochet stitches slant slightly this way. So if we're stacking crochet stitches that ever so slightly slant this way over and over and over on lots of rounds, then that's what causes this spiraling effect. Whereas if we turn our work over and work each round from the back, so we do our first round, turn it over, do our second round, turn it over, do our third round, turn it over. What this does is it means that our first round's like this, but our second round's like this, so it counteracts it. So if we keep turning, that makes sure that our granny square stays straight and the centre of our granny square doesn't start turning. It's not too obvious in smaller squares, but once you start making really big granny squares, the spiralling of the centre really gets quite obvious. So if you only take away one tip from this granny square tutorial, make it this one. Make it the one that you turn your work over at the end of every round. So let's work round 2. So I've pulled up my next colour yarn. If you're wanting to make a 1-colour granny square, I have a tutorial for that. I'll link it in the description. But for this tutorial, we're changing colours at the end of every round. So this is my granny square, round 1 of my granny square from the front. So we're going to turn it over and work from the back. So I'm literally going to flip my granny square over like this. And then we're going to join our next colour to any corner that isn't the one we just fastened off. So we fastened off over here, and that just makes our life a bit easier when we're weaving ends in if we don't join at the same corner every time. So we join in the next corner around, or any of the corners really. So I always recommend, it doesn't matter what round you're on, that you join your granny square in the corner space, and that makes it a lot less obvious where the chain space is. So if I show you here on this granny square, so if you can see on this final round, I've got a chain here and I've done a slip stitch join, and you can see that that doesn't look very neat. Whereas if I grab this granny square and we look at the final round, can't even see where my starting chain is here. If we make sure our starting chain is always in the very corner That means that it's less obvious when we're looking at the granny square as a whole, so that you don't notice where you've started the round. And you can see with the invisible join on the final round, it looks so much neater and it makes it so much easier when it comes to joining your granny squares together if you use the invisible join. So let's join this colour to this corner space. I'm going to lay my yarn tail across my crochet hook, and then I'm going to pull up a loop. And now I'm ready to start round 2. So another tip that's just a general crochet tip, it's not actually just a granny square tip, is with this yarn tail, if you join yarn like this, if you lay your yarn tail over the top of your crochet hook before you make this first chain of the starting chain, it actually tucks this yarn tail over to one side and makes that first chain really nice and neat. So I'm going to yarn over with my tail over the top of my hook and just pull it through underneath that tail. So as you can see, my tail's now over here, it's been caught by that first chain, and as we now make our starting chain, that tail is just there ready to be crocheted over the top of for the first stitch, and that secures that tail nicely. So to continue on with round 2, make 2 more chains. So we've made 3 chains total, and that counts as our first double crochet stitch. So next, work 2 double crochets back into that chain 2 corner space there. There's my first group of 3 double crochets. And now my next granny square tip, which will stop your granny squares being so holey, is we're not going to be doing any chains as we work along the sides of our square. So between our groups of 3 double crochets. On a lot of granny square patterns, it will tell you to do a chain 1 here. I don't recommend that unless you're following a specific pattern that needs it, just because it just makes your granny square really like stretchy and holey, and it can really stretch over time, and this not doing those chains will stop it stretching so much. So what we're going to do is we're going to skip these 3 double crochets, so skip, 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 and then into our next corner space here we're going to work a double crochet. So you can see there's that's a much smaller hole than you would normally get with a regular granny square pattern. Now work 2 more double crochets into the same corner space. And that's the first side of our granny square done. Next, make a chain 2 corner. Remember, we're doing chain 2 corners, not chain 3 corners, because it's easier to join your squares at the end. Then work another 3 double crochets into that corner space. And what we're going to do for the rest of this round is repeat this. So we're going to do 3 double crochets, chain 2, 3 double crochets in each corner space, skipping all of the double crochets and not doing a chain 1 here. So I'm going straight into this chain 2 space here and working 3 double crochets, 2 chains, and then 3 double crochets. So continue that all the way around, and then I'll meet you over here to finish off this final corner. So continue working around doing a group of 3 double crochet, 2 chains, 3 double crochet into the corner spaces, and my next corner space is the one that we joined this colour to. So to finish off this final corner space, I'm going to work 3 double crochets back into that same corner space that we joined our yarn. Then I'm going to chain 2 and I'm going to do that invisible join again. So let's do that together again. So I'm going to trim my yarn tail, use my crochet hook to pull that yarn tail through that second chain there. Take my crochet hook, and from the back I'm going to go through the stitch, the top of the stitch next to my starting chain. So I'm going there. I'm going to lay my yarn over my hook and pull it, use my hook to pull it through the top of that stitch. Then I'm going to take my crochet hook and go through the back loop of the second chain of that corner from the back. Yarn over and pull that tail through. And then finally, to fasten off, I'm going to go from the front through the back loop of that invisible join we've just made over the top of this starting chain. I'm going to pull up my loop and give it a bit of a pull to tighten and fasten off there. Okay, let's move on to our third round. So before we start round 3, we need to remember to turn our granny square over, and then we're going to find the corner where we fastened off, so that's over here, and we're going to pick a different corner space to join our next colour of yarn. So to join our colour of yarn, we're going to put our crochet hook into the chain 2 space in that corner. Remember, we're always joining in the corner spaces and not in the spaces along the side, so that our chain is less noticeable. So next, I've pulled up the end of my next colour and I'm going to lay it over my crochet hook and pull it through that chain space so that we've got a loop. Then I'm going to lay my yarn tail over the top of my crochet hook to tuck it over to one side once we've made our starting chain. And now we're ready for round 3. To start round 3, make a chain of 3. So for that first chain, I've yarned over and I'm pulling through both of the loops on my hook there so that our tail is tucked over to one side. Then make 2 more chains. And that chain 3 counts as our first double crochet. Next, work 2 double crochets back into that corner space. So on round 1 we only worked in the corner spaces, but on future rounds we're going to be having spaces along the side of our granny square, and these sides are going to get longer and longer as our square gets bigger. So when we're working along the side of our granny square, remember we're not doing any chain 1s along the side of our granny square. We're going to skip straight over these 3 double crochets and into that space there. So that space there, I'm going to work 3 double crochets. So that's 1, 2, 3. And then into the next chain 2 space, we're going to work that corner group that we did in round 2, sorry. So 3 double crochets, 1, 2, 3, then chain 2, then 3 more double crochets back into that chain 2 space. 1, 2, 3. And then we're going to repeat these steps all the way around. So 3 double crochets into the space along the side of the square, and then that corner group of 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet into our chain 2 spaces. So continue doing that all the way around, and I'll meet you over here to finish off this final corner. So once we finish round 3 together, we're going to do round 4 together, which is pretty similar to round 3. But if you're happy with your granny squares and the 6 tips that I've shared so far, I recommend fast forwarding to the end of the video, because that's where I share tip 7, and that is a real game changer. So I've continued working all the way around my granny square, and I've just made my last group of 3 double crochet into a space along the side of the square, and my next space is the same one that we joined our yarn to. So to finish off this round, we're going to make 3 double crochets into that chain 2 space. So that's 1, 2, 3. Then make 2 chains for that final corner, and then we're going to do an invisible join again. So I'm going to snip my yarn, use my crochet hook to pull that end through that second chain, put my crochet hook from the back underneath both loops at the top of the stitch there, yarn over and pull that end through. Then I'm going to take my hook and bring it from the back underneath the back loop only of the second chain of the corner, yarn over and pull through a loop. And then I'm going to put my hook from front to back through that back loop of the join we've just made and pull that at the end through one final time. So let's follow those tips again for round 4. So I'm looking at my square from the front so I can see the front of the stitches I've just worked. So I'm going to turn my square over. I'm going to find a corner that isn't the same one that we fastened off in, and I'm going to join my yarn exactly as we did previously. So I'm going to lay my yarn tail over the top of my crochet hook and pull up a loop. Then I'm going to tuck my yarn tail over the top of my crochet hook, and then I'm ready to start round 4. So start round 4 with a chain of 3, that counts as your first double crochet stitch. Then work 2 more double crochets back into that corner space. So as your square gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you're going to have more and more spaces along the side of your square, and it doesn't matter what round you're on, the pattern is always the same. We skip the 3 stitches of the double crochet, and into the space between the 3 double crochet groups we work 3 more double crochet. So I've got 2 spaces here, but as your square gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you will have more. So I'm going to work 3 double crochets into that space, Then I'm going to continue that along the side of the square, so I'm going to work 3 double crochets into the next space. Just like that. And then I'm going to work a corner group into the corner space, so those 3 double crochets, chain 2, and then 3 more double crochets back into the same corner space. So we're going to repeat that all the way around, and I'll meet you back at the end of the round and I will show you how we fasten off slightly differently for the final round of our granny square, and I'll also be sharing my final game-changing tip. So I've continued working all the way around my granny square for round 4, and I've just done 3 double crochets back into that same corner, just like we've done on previous rounds. Then I've done a chain 2 and I'm ready to fasten off. So I'll show you how the invisible join is different for this final round. So I'm going to cut my end, use my crochet hook to pull that end through that chain. Then we're going to do the same steps as before. So I'm going to put my crochet hook from the back underneath both of the loops at the top of the stitch that's next to the starting chain. Yarn over my hook and pull the end through. Then I'm going to put my hook from the back underneath the back loop of that second chain. And I'm going to yarn over and pull through. Give that a pull just to make sure that it matches all of the other loops here. So next, thread your tail onto a yarn needle and go ahead and weave all of your ends in. Again, if you're not sure about weaving ends in, I'll link my tutorial for that down in the description. And then once you finish your square, you might find that it doesn't lay flat. The edges kind of curl up a little bit, and your corners are quite rounded. They haven't got a very nice sharp 90-degree angle. Well, my final game-changing tip is to block your granny squares, and when you block your granny squares you get nice corners like this and your square will lay nice and flat. I have a tutorial about blocking granny squares, I'll link on your screen here, and I'll also link over here a playlist that's all about different ways of joining granny squares, because it's all very well making lots of granny squares, but we need to join them together to make any kind of project. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and I'll see you again next time.